Alright, so the rest of the chapter is about aggregate supply and using this aggregate demand and aggregate supply to analyze the economy, what happens. The aggregate supply, let's see, is slightly different from the supply curve in microeconomics. Right? In microeconomics, again, we talked about the upward sloping supply curve, right? And the reason why the supply curve would slope upward, at that time we used the concept of profit, right? If you remember, right? Because profit is total revenue minus total cost, right? And total revenue is P times Q, right? Price per unit times how many units you sell, right? And then the total cost would be average total cost or per unit cost times how many units you produce, okay? So the profit is simply P minus ATC times Q. The difference between the price you charge and how much it costs to produce each unit, right? So you can say this is a profit margin, right? For each unit you produce and sell, you make this much money, right? And you multiply it by how many units you sell, that will be your total profit. Okay? So whatever the reason, if the price goes up, right? Holding other things constant, right? So holding the per unit cost remains the same. If the price goes up, right? That means your profit margin increases, right? So whatever you're producing, your product or service, right, becomes more profitable. Okay? So naturally, this producer would invest more money, right, and increase the output because that particular good or service is more profitable. Okay? Well, in macroeconomics, in order to explain why a short-run aggregate supply, let's say we have short-run aggregate supply, and of course in that case the P is price level, and this is the total output, GDP or income, right? Instead of any single particular good, right? So in order to explain why the short-run aggregate supply curve slopes upward, unfortunately we cannot use the same explanation, okay? Because in microeconomics, again, the key was the price of this particular product increases while the average cost of production remains the same, right? But in macroeconomy, we are talking about a price level. This is price level, right? That's the price of overall goods and services, right? So if the price level rises, then well, chances are, right, both the price of your product and the price of your input, right, the material and labor, whatever, right, will probably increase at the same time. That would be more, I guess, reasonable assumption, right? If the the price level rises, right, then both the price of your output and input will increase, right? So that doesn't mean that what that means in this particular product, or I guess we're not talking about particular product here, right? That cannot really explain this upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve, right? So How do we explain this, the shape of a short-run aggregate supply curve? Right? It's a little bit tricky, but let's try to understand what we're saying here. Right? A couple of reasons are provided by our textbook. Right? It says as the price of goods and services rise, prices of inputs such as wages and the price of natural resources rise more slowly. Yeah? So while we acknowledge that when the general price level rises, right, the prices of both output and input will rise, right? We assume that the input price will follow a little bit after the price of the output increases. Okay? Why? Can you imagine why? Well, you can, I guess, think this way, right? Whatever the reason the price of your product increases, right? So when the price of product increases, right, why would the resource price would also increase? Well, ultimately, because producers, right, try to increase the output. If they increase the output, quantity of their output, right, they'll have to use more resources, both natural resources and the labor, right? So eventually, after maybe some time, a month or two later, right, the demand for the input will cause the increase in resource price. Do you understand what I'm saying right now? Right? While in the increase in the general price level, right, indicate that both output and input prices will rise, right? There may be some order or sequence, right? That is, whatever the reason, consumers, let's say, economy improves, right? And people feel better about the economic situation, right? So they save little, save less, and spend more, right? So they buy more goods and services, right? And then initially the producers will try to increase their output, right? They'll increase the output, their production, right? And so eventually that's going to increase the input demand, right? And as a result, the price of input will also increase. But there may be some gap, right? There may be some time lag, right, between the output price and input price. Right? So here, what we're going to see in that situation is between that two adjustment, right? So from the moment that the demand for output increases until the moment that demand for input increases, right? There may be some time gap, maybe a month or two, right? 2 months, right? During that time, we will find out that when the general price level increases, producers temporarily find out their product, the profit increases, because while the price of their output increased, the input did not increase yet, input price, right? So that will cause the producers to increase their output. Okay, so we see this positive correlation, right, between the price level and the general output level, right? As the price level rises, the income and output will rise. But again, we're talking about a short run, right? In the short run, we're going to see this positive correlation, right? Eventually, given sufficient time, right, the input price will catch up with the output price, which means the profitability returns to the original level, right? So the output will return to the initial level, right? And as a result, we're going to have a long run. In the long run, we're going to have this vertical aggregate supply curve, right? Which means the price may rise, but the output and income will not increase, will remain the same, right? That's the idea of long-run aggregate supply. So that's one explanation for this short-run aggregate supply, right? So in a sense, people are kind of deceived, fooled, right? Producers are temporarily, they misunderstand what's going on, right? They see that the price of their product goes up, right? So they think temporarily, for a while, they think the profitability increased, right? So they increase the output, right? But pretty soon, they realize that not only their product price, but the input price also goes up, right? So when they find out the input price is higher, right, they're going to reduce the output back to the original level, right? So in the long run, there will be no change in the output and income, but only the price level will change, right? That's the idea, yeah? The second explanation that is provided by our textbook is a little even fuzzier, right? It's not really easy to understand, right? But let's try to understand what the textbook is saying. Right? It says some firms are slow to adjust their prices when the price level rises or falls. Yeah? Yeah. So among all the firms, right, there are some companies that are particularly slower in adjusting their prices. Yeah? And there may be some reason, right? Let's say you, in order to change your price, there is some cost, something like the catalog sales company, right? Suppose you have a department store, okay? Like LL Bean or Maze, whatever, yeah? And these department stores or sales, the retail companies, right? Traditionally, what they do is they print the catalog of all the things they sell, right? So once a year, they're going to send out these catalogs to their customers, right? And customers look at this, read this catalog, and from this catalog, they're going to order whatever they need, right? So, if the company has to change their prices, right, that means they'll have to publish another catalog, right? And these catalogs are expensive. I mean, if you look at these catalogs, traditionally it's about this thick, right? And it's in full color, right? So printing costs will be quite significant, right? So for certain small changes in price, it may be prohibitive, right? I mean, the companies may not be able to adjust the prices frequently, right? Because of that cost, right? So let's say, in general, the price level is rising, but your company did not adjust the price, right? Because of this, whatever the reason, right? Then consumers will find out that the product of your company are relatively cheaper than other companies, right? Other companies raise their prices, but your company did not raise the price, right? So, well, people will buy more of your product, right? So, what happens is here's the trick. You have to understand this. What this explanation is saying is, in general, there is no reason for this the short-run aggregate supply curve slopes upward, right? Because if all the companies adjusted their prices quickly, right? And whatever the situation there was, right? Suppose there is the reason why the output price should increase, right? And if all the companies raise their price immediately, right? Then there is no reason for the output to increase, right? You would have immediate, just vertical long-run aggregate supply, okay? But because some companies are slower in raising their price, right? They find out their output increasing. In other words, demand for their product increasing because consumers find out the products of this particular company is relatively cheaper compared to other companies, right? So let's say there are, 30%, right? Out of all the businesses, there are maybe 20%, 30% of the businesses that are particularly slower in adjusting their price, right? Then the output of this company will increase, right? So overall, what we are going to see in this entire economy is when the price level rose, because of this 20-30% of the company's increased sale, right, the output will appear to increase, right? So we are going to see this the positive relationship between the price and the output. Okay, so yeah, that's what this second explanation tells us. Excuse me. All right. Another thing we need to understand about this, the behavior of the short-run aggregate supply is stickiness, wage price stickiness. Okay? Let me give you the conclusion first. Okay? Conclusion is if there is no stickiness, in other words, stickiness means just slow adjustment. That's what that means. Okay? That's the opposite of flexible adjustment. Okay? In theory, in principle, right, we think the adjustment should be immediate and perfect, right? So, for example, we talked about the market for the loanable fund, right? Think about the interest rate and quantity of money, right? And we thought about the supply for the loanable fund, and of course the households are the suppliers, right? Households save money, and they bring that money to the bank or financial intermediary, right? And that becomes the supply for the money, right? And then there's the demand for money, right? And of course, demanders are, well, primarily businesses, right? Companies, when they need money, right? They would come to the bank and try to borrow money, right? So the idea was, well, what if the household saved a little more, right? Whatever the reason, the household feel that the economy is going down, they feel insecure about the economy, right? So they decided to save more, right? Then, as we discussed many times, right? When people or households save money and reduce their spending, the economy can shrink, right? Because total demand will go down, right? But the explanation of especially the classical economists was, no, don't worry about it, because as long as we have this flexible adjustment, flexible interest rate in the financial market, right? As soon as the supply for loanable fund increases, right? Well, at the initial interest rate, if the interest rate does not adjust, right? Then we're gonna have, of course, this surplus of fund, right? and that means if the household saved the $10 billion, only $5 billion returns to the circulation, right? And the economy will shrink, right? But as long as we have this flexible, freely adjusting interest rate, market will come to another equilibrium, right? Interest rate will come down, and as a result, the quantity demanded or quantity exchanged will increase, right? So more money will be borrowed by the companies, right? Investment increases, right? So the economy will continue to run at the same level, right? It's what we call equilibrium, right? Right? So that's the idea of flexible adjustment, right? And in most of the, in principle, we assume that we should have this freely adjusting rate, right? A price or interest rate or whatever, right? However, especially in the labor market, we see stickiness, right? And stickiness means the adjustment is rather slow. Okay? And what are the reasons for those? Yeah? Future price changes are hard to predict, and they are not accurately reflected in the long-term contract. Yeah? What are we talking about? Yeah? This is a very important concept. Try to pay attention and try to understand what I'm saying. Right? There is a price expectation. I end up explaining a few things together here. Right? Let's see. Okay, so here we have aggregate demand. Okay, we have short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand here, right? And then here let's think about the labor market. Supply of labor and demand for labor. Right? And the supply of labor would be affected by expectation, right? What workers expect. Okay? So let's say price expectation increases, let's say. Right? So for some reason, people expect that the general price level will rise in the future. Right? Next year, they think that there will be 10% inflation. Right? Then workers will demand higher wages. Right? Because 10% higher inflation means everything becomes 10% more expensive, right? So in order to maintain your current standard of living, right, your wage needs to increase by 10%, right? So workers will expect higher or demand higher wages, right? Wage demand will increase. Okay? And what that means is in the labor market, supply for labor will decrease. Why? Because right now we have this equilibrium level of the amount of labor or employment, and say this is the initial wage level, right? But now workers demand higher wages. Right? That means in order to supply the same amount of labor, they would require higher wage. Or another way to understand it is At the current level of wages, right, not as many workers are willing to work. So the labor supply, quantity supply for the labor would decrease, right? So you can understand this shift in the labor supply curve either way, right? Either, you know, at the same, in order to provide the same level of employment or labor, workers demand higher wages, right? Or at the current wages, the quantity supplied for their labor goes down, right? Either way, right? What does that mean in the aggregate supply and aggregate demand, right? When the labor supply decreases, aggregate demand, aggregate supply shifts back, okay? Because aggregate supply is affected by primarily two things, okay? The amount of labor, amount of resources, right, in the economy, right, available in the economy, and also technology, okay? So this comes a couple of slides later, right? So here, let me go on, and you will catch it better, right? So here, the pricing wages have to be sticky when they also sales are usually adjusted only once a year. So what it's saying is when if workers knew exactly what's going to happen in the future in price level, right, they would have considered that in their labor contract, when they signed the labor contract, right, they would have considered this future increase in price level. But because that expectation cannot be perfect, right, even when the things happen, right, and there is a reason why the wage would rise or come down, right, the adjustment of wages will be slower, right? That's what the stickiness means. Okay? Another reason why prices and wages will be sticky is prices and wages usually go up, but seldom come down. Yeah. When the economy is slower, goes into a recession, right? Then frequently you see the layoffs, right? Companies can lay off the workers, right? But it's hard to cut their wages, right? Can you imagine the situation? I mean, one day you go to work and your boss calls you up and says, well, our products are not selling very well, right? Economy seems to be slower, so I'll have to reduce your salary, right? That doesn't really happen frequently. Perhaps because there's a contract, right? When union workers get usually 3-year contract, right? So just because the economy is slower, the employers cannot cut the wages of their employees, right? And even if you don't have that 3-year contract, usually you have at least 1-year contract, right? So your salary is usually adjusted once a year, right? Once a year you have some evaluation, your performance evaluation, okay? And you may negotiate with your employer and agree to your wages or salaries for the next year, right? So, you don't really see your wages coming down every time the economy slows down, right? It's called the ratchet effect. Right? I find out that this ratchet is not very familiar to Korean students, right? Have you ever seen this thing? This is a tool can be used to tighten the bolt. Yeah? If you go to the automobile repair place, right? Or whatever, the repair shop, right? You see this thing, right? And, you know, in order to tighten the board, you have to turn it, what? Clockwise, right? And if you don't have this ratchet, if you just use this, say, spanner, something like, you see what, you understand what I'm trying to draw here? Not a very good drawer, right? Whatever, right? If you use a spanner, right, then you have to tighten once and then lift it and then you do it again, right? But if you have this ratchet, right, inside this head, right, inside this head there is a little gear, one directional gear, what we call. Something like that. And there is a catch. Okay. So when the gear turns this way, yeah, it allows the gear to turn. But as soon as it turns the other way, it catches, right? So it prevents the gear from turning the other way, right? So this ratchet, you just do this, right? And it turns the board only one way, right? And if you want to loosen the board, then you would switch. You would turn this knob, right? And then it reverses the direction, right? So you know, all you need to do is, you know, use this movement, right? And you don't have to lift it and, you know, turn it the other way around, right? Like spanner, right? Okay, so ratchet effect means one directional effect, right? So prices and wages usually go up, but they seldom come down, right? That's what we mean by ratchet effect, right? All right. Okay, the frequent price changes are not worth the menu cost. As I explained a few minutes ago, some businesses, like, you know, catalog sales business, right? They find that changing prices are rather costly, right? So when there is, you know, some reason to change the prices, right? As long as that is not very significant, right? They may just ignore, right? And they try to avoid, right, changing the prices frequently, right? These are the reasons why the prices and wages may be sticky. Yeah. All right. So since we are talking, we talked about the slope of the short-run aggregate supply curve, right? The next thing we talk about usually is the shift, right? What can shift the short-run aggregate supply curve, right? The first one is the labor force or the capital stock, right? Basically, the amount of resources. Okay? When the amount of resources increase, the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift to the right, right? If the amount of resources decrease, then the short-run aggregate supply will shift left, right, or decrease, right? The productivity, as the productivity improvement means you can produce larger output with the same amount of resources, right? So basically, it's the same effect as increase in resources, right? But if you remember, in microeconomics, we talked about this. What is this? PPF or PPB, right? Production possibility frontier or production possibility boundary, right? And that was the maximum possible level of output given a certain amount of resources, right? And then technology, right? So those are the two factors that determine this PPF or PPB, right? We have the same idea here, right? We're talking about total supply of goods and services in the entire economy, right? So ultimately, there will be what we call a potential GDP, potential output, right? You remember the concept of potential GDP, right? That's the level of output when what? When the economy is in full employment, right? If all the resources are employed, right, then economy would achieve this level of output, right? So in the long run, right, the aggregate supply should be determined right there, right? So long run aggregate supply would be vertical at the level of potential GDP. Okay? That's the idea, right? But so in the short run, depending on the amount of resources provided and the technology, right? The short run aggregate supply can shift to the right or left, right? That's the idea, right? So basically two things, right? Amount of resources and productivity. And productivity is influenced by technology, right? Okay? So we're talking about same concept, right? The PPF and the long run aggregate supply, or aggregate supply, right? It's a similar situation, right? All right, so before we actually get into this analysis, right, we need to talk once again about the expectation. The role of expectation is very important in macroeconomics, right? In fact, when you take the next course, actual macroeconomics after this course, right, you're going to learn about the rational expectation, or rational expectation is, right, the stream of thoughts in the economics. Of course, we think it started with the classical economic theory, started by Adam Smith, right? And then sometime around 1960s, 50s, 60s, right? There was a new school of thought called the Keynesian, right? Started by John Maynard Keynes, right? Actually 1940s, starting from the 40s, right? 30s, 40s, right? And then around 1970s, there was a group of economists called themselves monetarists, okay? And then in 1980s, that's when I was in graduate school, right? Started learning economics, right? And at that time, the main stream, again, the most popular theory at that time was rational expectations, right? So that's really the group of economists that believe that the people have rational expectation, right? So it's an interesting idea, right? But anyway, so here, widely held expectations of future price level increases are self-fulfilling. Okay? Let's try to understand what this means. Okay? We already talked about it actually here, right? Let's say most people, workers, believe that price is going to rise in the future, in the near future. Everything is going to be more expensive, right? Then what's going to happen is they will demand higher wages, right? And that means in the labor market, supply for labor decreases, right? And as a result, the wage would increase, right? Because they demanded higher wages, right? And when the wages increase, then the short-run aggregate supply would decrease. Why? As we just talked about it, right? One of the factors that can shift short-run aggregate supply is the amount of resource, right? And labor is, of course, the most important resource, right? So when the labor supply decreases, aggregate supply would decrease, right? So typically, we can write it this way. This is the short-run aggregate supply at the initial price level or initial wage level, right? Let's say initial price expectation and then the initial wage level, right? And this new short-run aggregate supply, you can write it this as a price based on new price expectation, right? Or based on new wages. Sorry, what? W1, right? So of course, W1. New price expectation is higher than the original price expectation, or you can say W1 is higher than W0, right? Then we're going to have a new short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay? So what's going to happen in the economy? Okay? Well, the economy is going to move from the initial equilibrium to a new equilibrium here, and price level will rise and output will decrease. Output and employment and income all will decrease. Right? This is what we call self-fulfilling prophecy. Right? Because even if there was absolutely no reason for this decline in aggregate supply, right? Just because people believe, right, that the price level will be higher in the future, right? So they demanded higher wages, right? And that means the labor supply shifted to the left or decreased, right? And that would cause the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift back, right? And finally, the price level would indeed rise. Right? Right? Self-fulfilling or self-realizing prophecy. Okay? That's the idea. As time passes, people attempt to correct their expectations. Yeah? So this assumes that initial expectation might have been incorrect. Right? Right? Let's see. And then what's going to happen in the market? Right? Okay, so this the second paragraph was talking about the idea that initially people didn't realize that the price was rising, right? So what the story is, well, initially people, this original supply of labor was mistaken, right? The workers didn't really anticipate the price increase correctly, right? So they provided a little bit too much labor, right? That actually, let me explain this in the couple of slides later here. this would be situation for this idea, right? When the economy expanded, aggregate demand increased, right? Initially, people don't expect the price rise correctly, right? So I'll talk about it here in a few minutes later, right? Let me go back to here, slide, and let's see. Unexpected increases in input price would decrease short-run aggregate supply, right? Think about the situation like oil shock, right? Oil is a very important resource, right, in the economy, right? Because so many things are, produced out of crude oil, right? Not only fuel, but all the plastics and synthetic fabrics and all kinds of chemicals, so many things come out of oil, right? Suppose oil price goes up, whatever the reason, right? Then the short-run aggregate supply curve would shift to the left, right? And we're going to have this situation, right? So unexpected input price increases would shift the short-run aggregate supply to the left, right? Unexpected input price decrease would shift the short-run aggregate supply curve to the right, right? So, that's the idea of the factors that can shift the short-run aggregate supply. Okay? The long-run aggregate supply is vertical, okay? Because the idea that I explained here, right? Ultimately, the total output or maximum output that can be produced in an economy depends on only two things, right? The available amount of resources and technology, right? So, regardless of the price level, right, the long-run aggregate supply curve will be always vertical at the potential GDP level, right? And let me explain this in the next few slides here. Okay. So here. Now we're getting into actual analysis, and this is the time you should really pay your attention, right? And how we explain, right, what happens in the economy using aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Okay? Okay, so here, suppose that interest rate rise unexpectedly. Something happened, and households reduced their saving, let's say. Okay? Well, maybe households feel really optimistic about the future, right? So instead of saving, they decided to consume, they decided to spend more of their income, right? So in the money market, let's say here, okay, in the market for the loanable fund, okay, the supply and demand, right? The households reduced their saving, right? So the supply for the loanable fund decreased, right? And as a result, what? Interest rate went up. Okay? And when the interest rate goes up, what is the consequence? What's going to happen in the economy? How does that affect aggregate demand? Right, because aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus net export, right? So when the interest rate goes up, the money exchanged, the money borrowed will decrease, right? And that means the investment will be lower, right? And as a result, aggregate demand will shift to the left, right? So let me erase this now. Okay, so we have from the initial equilibrium between short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand, right? We were Y0 and initial price level P0, okay? And for some reason, households reduce their saving, right? And as a result, interest rate rises, investment declines, right? And so aggregate demand shifts back. Okay? Aggregate demand decline, right? So what's going to happen? From the initial equilibrium, temporarily, we're going to move to lower price level and lower output, lower income, lower employment, right? So, right, temporarily we'll be in that situation. Okay? But what's going to happen in the long run, right? Given sufficient time, workers will realize that, well, the price level came down, which means things became cheaper, right? Most of the goods and services became cheaper, right? And that means they can now accept a little lower wages. Notice that we are assuming free and flexible adjustment in wages, right? So forget about that sticky wages thing just for a moment, right? Assume that the everything is flexible, right? Adjust perfectly, right? Then workers will demand lower wages, right? So here, what's going to happen in the labor market? Okay? In the labor market, we have demand and supply for labor, right? And this labor supply was based on initial price expectation, and that's based on the initial expectation, right? But now workers realize, let's say this was initial price level, okay? But after economy moves to this point, workers realize that everything is cheaper, right? So they can increase the labor supply, right? Labor supply will increase at lower price level, right? Why? Because what happens is at the same initial wage level, they realize that actual purchasing power of this wage has gone up because everything is cheaper, right? So at the initial wage level, the amount of labor supply is a little bit higher, okay? Or another way to understand it is, while supplying this initial level of wages, level of supply, initial amount of supply, labor supply, they demand a little bit lower wages. So either way, you can explain that this increased labor supply. Okay? When the labor supply increases, what is it going to do to the short-run aggregate supply curve? When the available amount of resource increases, what happens to the short-run aggregate supply? It's going to increase, right? It's going to shift to the right, right? So short on aggregate supply is going to shift to the right. Okay, so we're going to move from this point to this point. Okay? So initial equilibrium was here. Temporarily we will be here at E1, but eventually we're going to move to this point, right? And then stay there. That will be the final adjustment, right? So what happened, if you look at starting point to ending point, right? We have this vertical long run average supply curve. Okay? So in the long run, what we're going to see is the prices may increase or decrease, right? But the total available, I'm sorry, the GDP, total output and income will stay the same, right? Eventually, the general total output and income will stay the same. Real amount of output, right? Real income and real employment. Okay? So in macroeconomics, there are real variables and nominal variables. Okay? The output, income, employment, these are real variables. Okay? Prices, wage, and also you can say interest rate. These are nominal variables. Okay? What's the difference? Well, the thing is, if price doubles, let's say, if the price level doubles, what does that mean? If price level doubles, is it really bad? If everything's twice as expensive as before, right? Not really. If your income doubles, right, then the twice as large or twice as high price level doesn't mean anything, right? In other words, when we say nominal variable, right, the notion is kind of meaningless. Price is meaningless in the economy, okay? But the actual output, it is meaningful, right? When we're talking about the real amount of goods and services you can consume, right? That matters, right? But the employment also matters, right? How many people are employed, right? That's a very important, concept, right? But the prices and wages and these things are tend to be meaningless. So here, if you look at this, you can understand it, right? The prices may go up or down in the adjustment depending on the demand and supply, right? But the ultimately the real output, real income, real employment, right? That will stay the same in the long run, right? So economy will adjust, right? So the idea here is initially, the starting point was this, right? Interest rate went up, right? And as a result, the aggregate demand shifted back, right? So initially, economy would go down, right? But pretty soon workers realize that, well, even though their nominal wage, even though the price level has come down, right? As a result of change in price level, the real wage has gone up, right? So they would adjust their behavior, and eventually the economy will come back to the initial potential level of output, assuming flexible adjustment in the price and wages. Assuming the prices and wages adjust freely, perfectly, right? We're going to have that kind of adjustment, right? Here's another example. Here we're talking about the opposite case. Here, instead of workers, the companies became more optimistic about the future, right? So they think the next year their economy will be stronger, right? So their products will be selling more, right? And in order to prepare for that, you need to increase your output. And for that purpose, you need to buy more equipment and install another assembly line, right? So let's say companies decided to increase their investment, right? And then immediately the aggregate demand will shift to the right, right? You need to be able to follow through this process and explain, right? In your final exam, my guess is you will see at least one or two essay question, right? And the essay question will be something like this, right? Using the graph, right? Explain what happens to the economy, or explain the adjustment process in the economy, right? So here. So we are talking about the opposite situation here. Let me try again, once again. Okay. So from the initial equilibrium, we have aggregate demand and short-run aggregate supply, right? From the initial price level and income level, right? For some reason, aggregate demand shifts to the right. In this case, the companies felt optimistic, right? So they increase the investment, right? So aggregate demand shifts to the right. Then, of course, the price level would rise, and the output and income and employment will all increase, right? So economy will move to that new equilibrium, right? But pretty soon, what's going to happen? Workers realize that everything became more expensive. Okay? So in the labor market, let me use N here, right, instead of L. In macroeconomics, we usually use N for the employment. Okay? So from the initial supply and demand for labor, initial wages, right, and initial employment, right, workers realize that, well, income went up, output went up, and unemployment went down, which is good, right? But then they also realized that everything became more expensive, right? So at my current wage, at the initial level of my wage, right, my real purchasing power actually went down because now everything's more expensive, right? So in order to maintain my current standard of living, I need to demand higher wages, right? So workers' wage expectation goes up, right? Which means supply for labor decreases, right? So this is, this is based on the initial price level, but at higher price level, workers will demand higher wages, which means the labor supply will decrease, right? And as a result, wages will rise, right? And the labor supply or employment, right, will decrease, right? Well, what does that mean in terms of short-run aggregate supply? When the resource price goes up, right, aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply will decrease, right? So eventually, what's going to happen is short-run aggregate supply would shift to the left, right? And eventually, we're going to come back to this final equilibrium, right? And price level would be even higher, right? And what? We're going to have this long-run aggregate supply at the potential GDP. Right? So in the long run, when dust settles, in other words, when all the adjustments are done, right, the economy will come back to the initial or potential level of output and employment. Right? And remember, potential output means what? Unemployment rate will be at the natural rate, right, at the moment. Right? So temporarily, economy can deviate, right? Economy can be above the potential rate or below the potential rate, right? But eventually, when all the adjustments are done, right, economy will always return to the potential level, right? That's the idea of long-run aggregate supply. All right. Well, I just made a wrong statement. Okay? Equilibrium income doesn't always happen at the potential rate. Again, remember the concept of equilibrium, right? Equilibrium simply means no change, no further change, right? That doesn't mean everybody's employed or everything's perfect, right? So, depending on the situation, right, the economy came to an equilibrium, but the potential income could be a little higher than that, right? So, situation is, suppose, yeah, we are in equilibrium. Yeah. Yeah. But the potential income, potential GDP could be here, right? And what that means is what? We have this gap, right? Gap between the potential GDP and actual GDP, right? What we call GDP gap, right? So in that case, we have to do something, right? Because unless we do something, the economy is going to stay there, right? This is an equilibrium income, which means there will be no further change, right? So on Thursday, I'm going to give you this a little. We got a couple of slides remaining in this chapter, right? And we'll talk about this, and we're going to move on to chapter 16. Okay? Any question? I'll see you on Thursday.